I do want to start by telling everybody that I'm giving a talk very different from one that I normally give, and one different, I think, from what all of you have heard so far this week. I'm not going to talk about my own science. I'm going to do, as Al said, a retrospective. Let's look back at how we got where we are, and also some look at where we are and where we might go from here. And as I thought about this, the first question, of course, was why me? Why did Al choose me? And I think this slide pretty well says it. This is Al's reasoning. It's clear. These are my credentials. There are a few others in the room I would put in that category, but I guess I qualify. So, what is it that I want to do? I want to try to go back in time. Let's go back 40 years or so. That's really the time that I see a lot of things beginning in the HAB field. Try to give us a feel of what things were like and what went on. If I gave you a prologue to the screenplay, if you will, it would be something like, well, we have several decades of struggles and hard times and difficult funding issues and so forth, and then with some luck, some actual either good timing, good fortune, or just plain luck, some things happened that made a huge influence on this field. There was some intervention by Mother Nature. There was then some dark period. Some call it we actually had a war in this community. I am going to talk about it, Al. And then we've had some rapid growth, major accomplishments, major progress in terms of programs, and then lots of struggles as well. So it's an interesting story, and if you'll bear with me, let's start at the beginning. And beginning, as I said, is in this case is a figure that shows something we produced for Congress some years ago. What do we know about this problem back before 1972? And basically, if you look at the little circles, we had three syndromes we really knew about or much at the time. PSP on the East Coast was restricted to the far eastern part of Maine, just that one little dot up there. On the West Coast, it went all the way up the coast. We had NSP down in the Gulf of Mexico, and we knew something about the ciguatera fish poisoning. Freshwater HABs, I don't have any equivalent map. It'd be interesting kind of to look at that. It's clear that people knew about them and were working on them, but I would think they would have the same scale or the same sort of, compared to today, a much, much reduced appreciation for the problem compared to what we have now. There was no national recognition of this HAB problem. We didn't have an umbrella term that brought everything together. The New England and Florida phenomena were called red tides, but we didn't have this harmful algal bloom term at that point. Funding was very difficult. There were only a few agencies willing to cover this kind of work. Sea grants, small programs typically, occasionally an NSF grant. Always we were in direct competition with many other disciplines, with fisheries or zooplankton or you name it. We had to fight in that sort of arena compared to, as you know now, we have a lot of our own funding programs. Everyone was basically on their own, and so as those old-timers are prone to do, I will say, if you think it's hard now, you should have seen it back then, okay? It was difficult to get funding, and it was hard to get any sort of programs going. But on the other hand, we knew so little that there were so many discoveries waiting to be made. And the one way I thought I'd go back and tell you a little bit about what it was like was to take a look at the first couple of the conferences that we held. These are the international HAB conferences. First one held in 1974 in Boston. Has the dubious distinction where the editor of this proceedings was the only one of our editors that's ever been sent to jail for embezzlement. Little known fact there, but there were only 4 countries at that meeting, and the U.S. was prominently represented, but still only a few dozen people, and many of them were not devoted to HABs. They were working on phytoplankton ecology or other topics, but just did this as one of their interests. The major new event was the 1972 New England red tide, which was hugely influential in getting me into this field. And there were lots of key papers on bloom dynamics and dinoflagellate taxonomy. I wanted to highlight a couple, though. One had to do with cysts, and this is a little bit of just the start of the good fortune we had in this field. This is David Wall, who was at Woods Hole, a geologist, and he and his colleagues were they've been typically working on the fossil record and looking at these organisms. They could dissolve all the rock away and find these cell walls, basically, of organisms they thought were extinct and were called hystricospheres. They had a whole name for them. They had genera, species. It was a whole field. And then they discovered that these had counterparts in the modern plankton and modern sediments, and they developed methods to process those sediments so that you could get the living forms of these. They could be germinated and turned into swimming vegetative cells, and then they could connect all of these together. So they weren't extinct. Many of them are still living. And then another talk during that conference was by Karen Steininger, who we dearly wish would be here with us this time. She had a very insightful talk. She, way back then, highlighted the importance of these stages of the blooms that we all know, the initiation, development, transport, and decline. But this little quote, I think, shows some of the foresight that she had. She basically says that these investigations by Dave Wall lend credence to the speculation that blooms might originate from dormant stages, and these stages might be associated with sediments. And this brings up the question of whether there might be seed beds. And I like this last sentence. It would seem that this avenue of research should have a high priority among phytoplankton systematists and ecologists. So this is 1974, and she's highlighting that, hey, you guys should think about studying cysts. And of course, I was a graduate student in the audience. I very quickly got in touch with Dave Wall, and in short order, we went out to some of these Cape Cod salt ponds. Here's a cyst of then what we called Goniolax, germinating. For the first time, we're seeing what this organism and how it cycles between the benthos and the water column in what has proved to be a hugely important part of not only my research program, but HABs in general. And that was sort of the all beginning at that point. And then we went another 4 years to a meeting that some of you might recognize, Clarice and Charlie Jensch, these great pioneers in our field, that they organized down in Key Biscayne, Florida. And again, they were continued studies of Goniolax or Alexandrium, Gymnodinium or Karenia, and PSP and NSP. But there were a couple new things, and this was where a Japanese team and Max Taylor sort of concurrently described this organism living on seaweeds and coral surfaces that we now know as Gambrinodiscus toxicus. So Ciguatera, the source of Ciguatera was then linked now to a dinoflagellate. And this was an interesting development there as well. This tall woman on the right is Marie Kat from the Netherlands. She gave a talk about these people that got sick there from eating mussels. They had all of these GI problems. And basically, a little quote there says, these three dinoflagellate species were conspicuous: Dinophysis acuminata, Proricentrum redfieldii, and another Proricentrum too. And then she goes on to conclude that the simultaneous presence of Proricentrum species in the GI problems can hardly be seen as a coincidence. And so she ended her talk with this picture. I always remember it. It's like, oh, okay, this may be our new toxic organism causing this DSP problem, but she missed it. It was that Dinophysis in the assemblage that was in low abundance, but much more potent than I think anybody realized. So that sort of, we jumped from there. We actually went 7 years between that meeting and the next international conference, which was then held up in St. Andrews. But that was a very, very important interval for this field. And one of the first things that happens, Chris Gobler, I'm sure, would remember this. He would have been a very young graduate student at this time. This is the brown tide that hit Long Island and literally came out of the blue. It hadn't been experienced before. The water turns to look like chocolate. It basically wiped out the bay scallop industry, which has struggled or been basically devastated since then. And it was this huge, highly visible bloom in a very populated part of the country. And then a year or so later, this event happened. This affected me. It was a very unusual thing. We had 19 humpback whales die in a 1-month period right in Massachusetts Bay. And this was happening in the fall. It was a real mysterious thing. People actually thought some deranged person was out there shooting them, killing them with some high-powered weapons. And in fact, after a lot of investigation, it turned out to be saxitoxin, that they were getting this toxin from the mackerel that they were eating, and that this was lethal enough at that stage to kill these huge animals. And then simultaneously, up in Canada, 4 people died and several hundred got sick from this mysterious toxin. You can see these mussels from Prince Edward Island. And this was where the NRC got a SWAT team basically together. Jeff Wright here was hugely important in that, and it was incredible. In like 3 or 4 days, they figured out what the toxin was, and that's our domoic acid. That's what we now know, but it all happened in a very short period of time, brought about by this poisoning incident, which occurred at the same time as these whales were dying. And then just a few months later, up in Europe, on the western part of Europe, this huge bloom of what we then called Chrysochromulina stretches all along the coast of Sweden, parts of Denmark, killing everything in the shallow waters, a huge mass mortality event that caught people's attention there. And to keep the story going, we had then in North Carolina, people having difficulties breathing and getting sick, and actually thinking that there was an old sunken German submarine that was leaking some sort of toxic gases up into the water and then onto the beaches, and that's what was making people sick. And it was Pat Tester and her colleagues that then, this satellite image shows the Gulf Stream on the right in red, and the filaments that are coming off of it towards the Outer Banks area that were carrying Carenia, toxic Carenia, that were causing that problem. And it really devastated that area. In fact, it led to the first efforts to try to call these events disasters and to get federal funding for it. Excuse me. Now, what comes next? This little organism, Pfiesteria, in that same sort of interval. Joanne Burkholder discovers an organism that's killing fish by the millions, and if you looked at many of these fish, they had these ugly lesions on them, and all of a sudden there's talk of this ambush predator, an organism that would release a toxin and kill or stun or kill the fish, and then they would attack it and eat parts of the flesh. So over that interval, you can see all of these things that happened. And part of what I'm saying to you now is, doesn't this sound a little familiar? We are in another stage like that now. This then got a lot of attention, finally. We were getting Congress's attention. We were getting the world's attention. And in terms of the world, then that's when the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, the IOC, said, all right, then we need an international program on HABs. And that's what you see on the left. The first meetings were held in '87 and then '89. They didn't call them HABs at that point, actually. But the idea was to get a coordinated set of programs around the world. This wasn't a funding program where people could get grant money, but more a coordination effort that the IOC was doing. And one of the things they did on the right is to create an intergovernmental panel. You've all heard of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Well, we had way back then an intergovernmental panel, and still do, Intergovernmental Panel on HABs, IPHAB it's called, and that was the first meeting of that then in 1992. But we're still, I've gone a couple decades here, we are still individuals working, struggling, trying to get funding, yet all these big events are happening around us. And I put this here to remind me of again, one of these fortuitous things where I was having dinner with one of my lab mates from graduate school, and her husband worked in the astrophysics field. And he was telling us about these probes they were sending up to study Saturn or the moons of Saturn or something. And I remember saying, gosh, look at all the things that are happening in my field. We can't get money, and you're sending rockets up to look at a moon somewhere. How do you do this? And then he said, well, we plan, we coordinate. My whole field gets together and we come up with a decade plan. We say, what are we going to do for the next 10 years? Break it down. We're going to go here, we're going to go there. And then we go down, we all agree on those priorities, then we go down to Washington and we fight for it as a group. And I remember thinking, gosh, maybe that's what we have to do. We could do that. So I wrote a grant, got some money, and that led to a meeting that produced our first national plan, as we call it, in 1993. And this is the group that was there, a number of people in this room. You can see, I mean, I can't name everybody there, but you see Fran Vandola, you see Pat Tester, Rita Horner, that guy with the bushy black beard, that's Jeff Wright again. We brought down a token Canadian. He's looking very Scottish there, but he had just, helped to solve this domoic acid issue. There's Greg Doucette next to him with lots of hair. We've got Sandy Shumway, Joanne Burkholders in blue on the far right, and anyway, you can see a lot of people that you would recognize that were part of this program. So what we did, we wanted to prepare this guiding document that would motivate this multi-agency support that we really felt we needed, and basically to identify areas where funds should be directed for the maximum benefit. And we had very broad coverage. It was toxins, bloom biology, ecology, fisheries, food webs, pharmacology was part of this. It was a national, broad-scale program. So we produced this report, and then we said, okay, give us the money. We're ready. And of course, it didn't come. It was still a struggling time. And then our third or fourth fortuitous event happens. This second session of HAB in Paris. And one of the things that's fortuitous about this, and that's why I put the picture of the Eiffel Tower here, is that a program manager, the head of biological oceanography at the time, came to this meeting because he really likes Paris. Okay, he made it very clear to me. He just likes Paris and was off doing lots of things, but he was there for some of the sessions. And during one, he leans over to me and he says, why are we talking about this international HAB program when the U.S. doesn't even have a national program? And I said, bingo, that's what we've been trying. Hey, look, here's this report. And he took the report and he looks at it, comes back to me the next day and he says, it's too big, too broad. He says, can't go there. But what we will do is if you can carve out ecology and oceanography, we will fund a workshop. We'll try to get you going in that area. You get some money from NOAA as well, which we did. And that led to the EcoHab workshop we held in Winter Park, Colorado, another good place. The same program manager liked skiing in the mountains. So in any case, I don't have a picture of the participants. There were 40 of us there. And what I do, this is Winter Park as well, and I think it's a very appropriate image because truly this was the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for this field. Because I really see this as a pivotal point in our field where millions and millions of dollars have come to us, not just through EcoHab, but through other programs because of the program, the way we set it up, and the way we got it implemented. So what we did was create a focused program, as I said, ecology and oceanography. We emphasized regional HAB problems as well as the specific sort of smaller scale things that are needed. And I think one of the clever things that we did, in hindsight at least, is that in the back of this volume we had these pages for different parts of the country with these very clear maps showing what part of the country we're talking about and a brief description of the kind of problems that occurred related to HABs. And let me tell you, many times we were giving this out in Congress and delegations, and we'd pull that, open the page, show them what was happening in their region, and get them to see how they fit into the bigger picture. And this was a document that was just hugely beneficial that way. So how about implementation? We still have these reports but aren't getting anywhere. Well, there again, our fourth or fifth bit of good timing, we had Congress basically got into the picture and says, we are tired of all these agencies doing the same work. Let's get your act together, coordinate. And they're saying the same thing these days. If everyone's working in marine science, do something together. So the agencies have got this mandate, and they're looking around, what program can we find that all sorts of agencies can participate in? And there we are. We've got our report, and we can do that. We need physics. We need remote sensing. We need all of these things. And that's what led to this interagency funding program. And those were the glory days of EcoHab, because there would be a group of program managers from NOAA, NSF, EPA, and NASA, and I think ONR too was there. And they would come to the table, and EPA would fund these proposals, NSF would fund these, and they would all throw in $1 million or so. So we were funding 10, 15 projects a year on a steady basis with that kind of interagency cooperation. And I think a couple key things for that program, we again recognized the complexity of these regional phenomena needed big scale oceanography. The other one was that models also had to be part of those regional studies, and then still recognize that individual studies were needed. So another little reminder to me of the time. This was just, as much as we had EcoHab going, a lot of those other pieces weren't in place from that national plan. And I remember talking to a reporter from the Washington Post and saying, expressing my frustration and saying, well, the only way it seems we're ever going to get Congress's attention is if the reflecting pool turns red. And it didn't quite happen, but right after that, hysteria hit the region. It had been down in North Carolina, and then all of a sudden up in Maryland, lots of things start happening. Fish kills, again, with these lesions. There were people, the watermen working on the water were all complaining about these. They had lesions on their legs and so forth, and people that were on ferries or crossing bridges would breathe in something, and they said they would lose their memory. Lots and lots of strange things going on. And the people working, Joanne Burkholder and I was working on this, were having to use biohazard facilities. It was a sort of a scary organism to most people. And that sort of pushed the last straw, I guess you could say, because we then got Congress to act. You've heard about Habarka. Well, that was the origin of Habarka. And if you could read that text at the bottom, it says that NOAA is being asked to run this program to research and to control and to predict blooms and Pfiesteria piscicida. It's right in there. It was really something that they were worried about. It was in their own backyard, and it made all the difference. So at that point, we've got some legislation, we've got lots of things going well, and I remember thinking, well, what we really would like to do at this point is get a meeting, a U.S. HAB science meeting. And so we set that up. And the idea, and some of these are still valid, some of them aren't anymore. These were the original ideas. Of course, we didn't have a national HAB committee. This was just something I was doing with a few colleagues and setting this up. We wanted this to be for U.S. science and scientists only. We would occasionally let in a few people from other countries on an exception basis. It had to be low cost, especially for students. Students were the key. We wanted to get as many students as we can. We wanted them to mix with the PIs as much as possible. So there were no plenaries. That's clearly changed. There was no travel support except for students. That's remained the same. No concurrent sessions. And we basically were trying to keep everybody together for this optimal networking. And of course, as you've heard last night, beer and wine had a lot to do with that, as well as the venues we chose. And the venue we chose for the first one was, in fact, in Woods Hole at the Marine Biological Lab. We ran the meeting, and there was a series of sessions that were, first of all, to highlight these first two regional studies that had been funded, EcoHab Gulf of Maine and EcoHab Florida, and then other research in the country. Notice that there were no freshwater talks whatsoever at that meeting, and Pfiesteria was 30% of the talk. So you can imagine this meeting if 30% of them were about one organism. That's how significant that time was. And just a few pictures. Here's Dan Baden and Karen Steidinger. Here's Carm Thomas, Pat Glibbert, and you see John Ramsdell, who's not with us, Vera and Jack Rensel. And this, I love this picture of Carm Thomas and Ted. You can just look at the look on Carm's face. I mean, not only do they look alike, but they just seem to be just totally channeling each other there. It's beautiful. So here's Kevin and Al back then, and Vince. There's Vince Loveco as a student at the time. Here's another picture of Vince and Larry Haas. No man bun there you can see. John Deeds, okay, who, of course, looks 16 years old. He still does. Chris Gobler, one of his first talks, also looking like, and still looks like a perpetual teenager. Mario Senko giving his first talk about mitigation of HABs. And of course, that's where we started the tradition, which has thankfully continued to this day, of great dancing parties during this event. And that's Kathy Lefebvre and the Santa Cruz contingent at the time having a lot of fun. Noteworthy topics, well, this was, again, a real emphasis of this large-scale regional HAB science with this emphasis on bloom dynamics and modeling. So for the first time, we were talking about projects where no longer was it little rowboats and power boats or coastal vessels. We were using the ocean-class vessels that would allow us to, like off of Florida, to start going well offshore to study the blooms there in EcoHab Florida, or in the Gulf of Maine to run transects all the way up to Canada, well offshore, to start really learning about these huge regional blooms that you've all heard us talk about. Other topics or papers, well, then there's the Pfiesteria controversies that begin to emerge. And this is what I mentioned about a war. Some people did call this the Pfiesteria Wars. And these are the skirmishes at the beginning. You see Howard Glasgow talking about how Pfiesteria promotes these lesions in fish. And then right afterwards, there's another talk about induction of skin ulcers in fish by the zoospores of fungi. And then how about this last one, the ambush predator Pfiesteria, fact or fallacy? So we were starting to see dissension in the ranks. And then let's fast forward 3 years to the second symposium. The sessions are broken down much more regionally. We have got a lot of emphasis on pseudonychia, Pfiesteria, again, new technologies, and so forth. On the new technologies, it's of note that this is when we start hearing about qPCR being used for HAB species enumeration and detection. We had some of the new technology being used to map out Karenia blooms, leading to the BrevBuster. Rick Stumpf talking about the use of satellites for these studies, and then Chris Scholin talking about the ESP, the sort of the first data coming in from right prior to this, the first in situ detection of HAB organisms using DNA probes using the ESP. But again, the main story in many ways was Pfiesteria at this meeting. There was a huge amount of controversy at this time, and it was a lot of polarization. It was driven by many things, and I hesitated to even talk about it here because there's a lot of people that are probably still sore from the things that went on. There were personal vendettas. There were it was not a good time. And in fact, if you can imagine in a meeting like this, someone giving a talk and a whole group of people standing up and walking out in protest of what was going on. That was, in fact, going on. And in one of them, well, in fact, I've highlighted it here, Matt Perro, who's here with us now, he was talking about one of the issue was this life cycle of the Pfiesteria, which had been presented this way. It was the most incredible life cycle you can imagine, 24 different stages with amoebae in there and so forth. And many people were saying the amoebae don't exist, or this doesn't exist, or this isn't even toxic. We had a reporter from Science in the audience, I remember, sitting right behind me, basically hanging on every word, waiting to write a story about how this whole problem was fake or fake, whatever you want to call it. It was a very, very difficult time to navigate, and it did have a toll on the community. There's no doubt about it. Another noteworthy thing in this sequence is when Al placed in his lab, and John Deeds was the one who wrote or did the paper, and about, as you see at the bottom, the toxic mode of action of a new fish-killing toxin from Carlidinium micrum, which we now know as Carlidinium beneficum. And here's the quote: "This work confirms the association between high densities of this organism and fish kills that have been observed worldwide." So it's clear they're saying among fish kills worldwide, that includes the Pfiesteria fish kills. It's not being caused by Pfiesteria. They're being caused by Carlidinium. And that, of course, has led to this huge body of work that Al has led so capably, tremendous scientific accomplishments that have come out of that group and all the people that have left, that have been trained there for a long time. And then I guess what I will say here is that Karen Steininger, again, tried to be the voice of reason at this meeting, and she did a paper about harmful algal bloom science and standards, one perspective. And she basically tried to say to everybody that openness and sharing will be part of our fiber, should be part of our fiber, because there was not sharing. You could only get cultures of organisms if you were with one group, and again, I won't go into the details, but to sort of wrap it all up, how did it all end up? Well, certainly science won out in the end, like it always does. We now, I think, understand very well some parts of that problem. I think Al would not argue with me if I said that a reasonable explanation is that the fish were probably being killed by Carlidinium. Maybe Pfiesteria was there to eat pieces of the fish, but that the actual killing, the toxin part, was a carlotoxin situation. And the life cycle is nowhere near what was. There are amoebae and so forth. All those things have been shown. The one thing that remains a mystery to me, and I talked to Lynn Gratton about this yesterday, is what was called Pfiesteria hysteria. That was specifically referring to all these people that were getting sick on boats or ferries or on whatever, and having these syndromes. And you heard Lynn talk about what they're doing, domoic acid and the Native Americans. They did the same thing here with the watermen and so forth. Interviewed them, did all those studies, and if you see that at the bottom, it says, although there may be individuals who exhibited this hypochondriacal or basically psychosomatic type reactions, the recent outbreak of Pfiesteria-related illnesses, this is in Maryland, probably does not represent an episode of mass psychogenic illness. In other words, it's not a case of people generating illnesses in their minds. There was something there. We don't know what that was. For whatever reason, the problem disappeared from Maryland. People blame storms and so forth. But I don't know, I'd like to hear Al's view later. To me, this remains like, what really did happen? Lynn and others are saying there was something real that was getting people sick. Al does not think it's carlotoxin. I don't know what it is. So anyway, let's move on. Here's the meeting. This, I'm sure. Guess what do you think Al's saying? It is not Pfiesteria. He's just, he's saying that. Rob Magnian talked about his first presentation. This is when he was working with Maryland DNR. And you've got people that you recognize here with Quay Dortch, Barb Kirkpatrick, Pat Tester, Wayne Lideker. Here's Chris Sholin, and again, lots of others. And then Kim Reese, too. So Rafe, who we miss, of course, was looking nice and young back then. And there's Vera again. And, of course, we had the crab boil. That was a messy meal the other night. We had our version of it with lobster. And Sandy Shumway is not at all shy about the fact that she will eat the carapace and all the we call it tamale, that slime that's inside the back of a lobster. She loves it. And, of course, dancing. There's Lisa, who's always one of the first out there. Very hard to get Fran Vendola on the dance floor, but here she and Greg having a good time. Then we'll jump quickly, and I don't have time to go through all of these various things. What you're seeing here, though, at the next meeting, which was held at Asilomar in California and led by Chris Sholin, the very first one, MIRHAB. We finally have a MIRHAB regional project on the Great Lakes on freshwater algae. And now we're starting to get a little bit, only a few talks, but some. And you see, we've got recognition of human health starting to enter the picture more, and starting to also be some good molecular biology and so forth that's coming in. I find the bottom one interesting. Lisa was then talking about not the IFCB, but the use of one of the earliest flow cams, that they were trying to make it into something that could be deployed in situ, which I don't think ever really materialized, but clearly that interest has led to all this great work with the IFCB. So Chris and Edie Scholin were Chris was the convener. Judy Kleindienst, who has helped with the first two meetings, was hugely helpful with them as well. This is the first one away from Woods Hole. Here's some pictures of the parties, and you hear us talk about wine, lots of wine. Well, look in front of Kathy here, and you get a feeling for this is even better than Toledo. Okay, so and one of my favorite all-time pictures. Kathy's just full of energy going on. This is well into the evening. And of course, she never lost her energy either. So then moving on quickly, we've got the next one came back to Woods Hole. And again, I'm not gonna go into this. And again, I don't want to offend people if they're not listed up here. There's no way to. If any of you generated what was different, what was new, it would be different from mine. I fully recognize that. But basically, I'm trying to say that we saw Kate Hubbard talk about the way she uses ERISA on the pseudonychia populations. That was being introduced here. And all of a sudden, we're starting to hear all about splice leaders and polyketide synthase and things like that. And we're getting genetic and genomic studies that are appearing in our talks. We have, again, this Lynn Gratton, the beginning of the study that she is still reporting on here yesterday about the exposure of Native Americans to domoic acid. And then more talks as well. You notice 12 talks or posters out of 172 on fresh waters. This was in Woods Hole again, beautiful place. Here you see, some of the people that you can recognize. And this is fun because for the first time, we decided we were going to have a Halloween party. And Judy Kleindienst and Stacy DeGrasse and Barb Kirkpatrick said they wanted to do it. And I said, oh, no, let's not do that. That's a typical guy thing, just no one's going to bring their costumes cross country. Let's just have a science meeting. They just said, Don, go away. We're in charge. And Judy very cleverly asked, we paid for someone to come in and paint faces for the people who didn't bring costumes. Here's Tracy Villarreal. But of course, people did bring costumes. You can imagine Pat having to put this into a suitcase and travel. This was a great group effort. This was Mary Silver's group from Santa Cruz that came as a fish kill. Okay. And another noteworthy thing, this is Vince again, dressed up as Al Place. So for the first time we had a costume party, and the first time we had a costume party where people were dressing up as their advisors or mentors or whatever. So there was someone as Al, and there were two as me. This was Greg Doucette and Mike Brosnahan. I don't know, I don't see the resemblance, but yes. I'm on the right. Yes, I had a costume which would be very, very difficult to wear these days, but these times. Back then it wasn't so politically incorrect, but I was Howard Stern. So anyway, here's Kevin and Stella, a beautiful set of costumes. Can you believe he came all the way across country with his razor clam costume? I don't know whether he had a separate suitcase for that thing, But see, I was wrong. People had a great time. And here's Fran and Greg again. They're clearly getting along because Greg's wearing his pajamas now. So he's got his teddy bear. And anyway, of course, the person who didn't wear a costume, Jerry Plumley, was given a French maid's outfit that he had to put on during the party, and he was a good sport about that. And here's the dancing fish kill. And then again, a real good time. We had switched to a DJ at this point because making CDs showed the same thing we saw the other night, where there's sort of two different generations of people that like certain kinds of music and other music, and it's hard to anticipate that the DJ can do it well. Jumping then to Ocean Shores, Maryland, and if I again, without going through the details, lots of things going on, but if I ask most people, what do you remember about Ocean Shores? Most people, I think, would say, well, the weather. This was organized by Vera Trainer and Kathy Lefebvre helping and others, but it was the weather that was the story. We had storm after storm after storm. And in fact, the very first morning we got there and there was no power in the hotel, and only because one of the locals who always says he drives around, it's normal there, with a generator in his truck, we were running the projector and the sound system with a generator, but everything else was dark. I mean, it was huge winds, waves, foam on the beach. I don't know whether you can see this. We went out to dinner. This was one of these memorable dinners, and we drove through the rain and so forth and get to this restaurant, and of course they lost power, and we had to eat by candlelight or lantern light. And I'll never forget the waiter there. We say, well, what kind of wine should we get? And he recommends one called Sinister Hand. And it's basically about a vineyard where one of the sons, in order to win the vineyard from his father against his brother, has to cut his hand off. And of course, it's his left hand, Sinister. And so that's a wine I will never, ever forget. But we're sitting in the dark hearing, this is the wine you should drink tonight. But we go back through the roads and get to the hotel. They hand out flashlights so we can get to our rooms. But the sun would come out, and then another day later, another storm would come through. So it was really something. But of course, we had time at the end for dancing. There's Al again having a good time. Jumping now down to Texas and going much quicker. Lisa and Dina ran that one. Again, I won't go through the details, but now you're starting to see climate change, ocean acidification, things like that. Hans Pearl talking like he has for a number of years now about the cyanobacteria in climate. Jim Birch from MBARI talking about all the incredible technologies that they're developing and so forth. The seventh one was then in Sarasota, Florida. We've got, in this case, more on climate. We've got more on technologies. Again, the fresh water starting to appear. You've got Kevin Sellner talking about mitigation. And this was Barb Kirkpatrick and Leanne Flewelling running this meeting. And one of the highlights was a recognition of Karen Sanger. She's completely embarrassed by this attention, but totally deserving of it. Standing ovation at the banquet, just a great recognition of all of her contributions to the field. And this one, I just show this because there's a series of jokes. Women hate these jokes, but it's good to be a man because, it's good to be a man because weddings take care of themselves, right? Well, it's also good to be a man because you can meet someone at a party or a banquet wearing exactly the same clothes and be friends for life. And Mike Parsons and John Ryan. It's just, imagine two women with this picture. But anyway. We had another group, we had another Halloween party at this one, and this was my lab, led by Alexis Fisher in the middle, who this was basically going after the Alfred Hitchcock movie of the birds that we now know the birds were sort of driven to their frenzy by domoic acid poisoning. And so we all came there all bloodied with blackbirds on our shoulders. And most people, once we broke up, most people had no idea what we were doing, but if we got together, it made sense. And then we go to the 8th, which had a great logo, if you will. This was held on the Queen Mary, wonderful venue, different kind of a venue. Dave Caron, Meredith Howard ran that. Again, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but in terms of what other things that were happening, this is where Judy Kleindienst was retiring and was recognized I think very appropriately. Many of you know her, she's been a huge part of my program. She worked for me for 18 years and just was a great personality and a great help to all of us in this HAB program. And then we're here now. And of course, imagine if I asked you to put down what are the big highlights of this meeting. Scientifically, there's just too many to list, but certainly I want to recognize Al. Another thing that's memorable is probably that crab feast and the mess that some of us probably aren't used to. That was certainly fun. But there's another memorable moment that some of us saw, some of us may not have. I want volume. Come on, volume. Come on. Come on, we had the volume here. He promised me. I mean, I came down at 8 o'clock this morning. Okay, let's go back. Let's go back. Okay, so that's a memorable moment to be sure for the archives. All right, so how are we doing? We're here at the present. What's the status of the U.S. HAB problem? Excuse me. Well, that top panel is what I showed you before. Look at the bottom panel. Things are hugely different. The problem is much, much bigger than we certainly knew back then. You can see some of those represent expansions, like in the east, the northeast, where PSP now stretches down to Long Island. Used to be in just eastern Maine, and you get it in Puget Sound. There's all these new syndromes we didn't even know about back then, the ASP, the carlidinium, DSP, and so forth. Just, there's another way to look at this. We made this diagram for Congress, trying to put these big ovals instead of these circles. And of course, one of the problems with this is what it does about the freshwater problems. We sort of put a single dot inside some of these states because it's not, the alternative is this, right? But my challenge, and I've already told this to Tim Davis, we do need these maps for Congress. We need this. They want to know where these problems are, and a single dot in a state doesn't do it. This doesn't do it necessarily either. So my challenge to the freshwater community is please try to come up with a map or a series of maps. Maybe it has to be state by state or something, where we can really try to give a visual picture of the scale of this big problem now. So in terms of programs and funding, I think that right now the U.S. HAB program is set up, it's well designed. We have a set of complementary programs. And what do I mean by there? We started with ecology and oceanography. We then added MIRHAB, which is monitoring and event response, so using the technologies to help monitoring. We have prevention, control, and mitigation. That had to be a separate program because there were days when we'd write a sort of a mitigation-based proposal and it goes into competition with basic science of eco-HAB or ecology, and it wouldn't compare. It was very hard. Typically, mitigation, control topics are very controversial, hard to get good reviews on, so you need your separate program. And then COHH, which brings in the combination of oceanography and human health, and it's a really nice package. And it's taken that national program, and you can see it's parsed it up into these different programs, and it's actually working very well. The current status, we basically have, after 12 years, we redid the national plan with this one called Harness. So we have a new research agenda. We made the mistake of saying this is 2005 to 2015, so it's already and seems to be out of date. My view is that it's not, that there's still many things left to be done there. That report's still very good as a guiding document, and it's just too expensive and too much work to try to do it all again right now, at least. In terms of programs and funding, I think it's safe to say our congressional support is stronger than ever. It includes legislation with multiple reauthorizations, and this is sending a very strong message, not only to the politicians themselves, but to agencies. Right within NOAA, our program managers and others need this legislative push from Congress to help them direct money to us and our programs as opposed to moving it into other areas. So this is huge. But the program really has taken some major funding hits through the years, and it's really limping along in that regard. Steve Thurr showed data similar to this. This one begins around FY07, but if we went back further, you would have seen that the numbers were actually much, much higher. Now we're talking about HABs and hypoxia together, and it's typically 2/3 HABs, 1/3 hypoxia, but still, this is a total of that. Notice the little green bars those are the ship time funding. And there was a time when we used to be able to get ship time for our projects from a separate pool of money within NOAA. And you can see it's $1 to $2 million a year at times, and that was funding a lot of these big regional programs. But you also see it die out when NOAA did some reorganization, and that pool of money was absorbed into another one. So that's gone away. But there have been several funding crises. There was one that doesn't even show up here that happened around 2004, 2005, where we went from a House and a Senate mark near $20 million for this program. Both of them, they were differed by only $2 million, and they come out of that conference and they give us $10 million. So we still don't know why that happened. We then fought our way up, you can see, to 12, 13 million, and then you remember Steve talking about you could, at FY11, FY12, that drop there, another one of those little step functions downward hit us. But as much as that looks bad, I think there is some positive silver lining. Being able to sustain that program where many programs have lost money is actually a strong statement that we've been doing better than others, even though it's not as good as we would like. But this is the figure that probably really affects the most of you, and this is a sad story. These are the actual number of projects that have been funded through the external competitive research. And you can see how much. This one does go back, and you can see the early days of EcoHab, where we're funding 10, 15 projects a year, even up to 25 in the years in the 2002 interval. And then that's where we have some of the big hits I talked about, and you see some more hits coming. But it's this huge fluctuation, and especially over the last 8 years or so, 8, 9 years, very big gaps where there's no funding, there's been no new starts, no funding at all. So, all right, what's the funding outlook going forward? Well, I think, remember I used the analogy for 85 to 88, we're in another one of those eras where multiple high visibility HAB events, like the big domoic acid events on the east and the west coast, Lake Erie, Toledo, the green tides in Florida, and so forth. These are all catching congressional attention. But this year is going to be a very good test as to whether we can persevere. So I just got this message yesterday. I asked TJ Loudermilk, the guy that I told you that I went down to DC to meet this week. He sent this message. I said, can you give us an update? I want to tell people, is this, for this letter, I wanted everybody to contact your. And he said, now this was the first message I got. He says, thanks for your help. The letter is doing pretty well, including from members whose staffers I've never contacted directly. So some people have gotten to their representatives as we had hoped. And before you look too hard at this list, he just sent me an update late last night. He says, updated list. Now we've got 49. Remember, the original letter they wrote to President-elect Trump was 47. So just as of last night, it's 49. And those of you who haven't done this, please do. It's making a difference. Even if your representative is listed here, still send things in. Still talk to your friends, colleagues, and students and so forth to do this, because they keep track of the messages. And this is like the first battle. But we're doing better than we thought in just a day or two, and I'm actually very encouraged by this outreach. So in terms of research capacity and progress on the positive side, in terms of the current status, there's no question, HAB research has been really productive over the last few decades. We have many exciting projects, discoveries, and products and so forth. And Al said it yesterday, I think, at the end of one talk. He says, I can't believe we've come so far. And I think that's true. If you think about how long what I've just described, and it really is only the last 20 years or so, we have greatly improved knowledge of these regional HAB phenomena. We have lots of good research teams around the country, which we need with a diverse problem like we have here. It looks like the marine and freshwater communities are getting better integrated. I thought you'd find this interesting. I spent some time going through all these symposia proceedings, and as I told you in the beginning, there were no freshwater talks at all, and you can see it going up to the point where it's on the order of 35% or so And certainly a question that's been raised by some is are we now getting too big? Maybe too big for single sessions. It's something I think for the NHC and others to think about, because now we've got two big groups together, and how are we going to handle that? So in terms of positives, again, now the management community is well integrated in this national program. I think HAB phenomena, at least in the marine side, I can't speak to the freshwater one, I don't know that well enough. We have very good capabilities to respond to these regional and unexpected HAB events. And I was, for example, when the domoic acid problem started on the West Coast, I knew that Rafe Cadella and Vera Traynor and others would be out there giving good information to the press, really getting measurements, doing things that were needed to understand that and to try to help with that problem. We have good teams all over the country. And I think the last one is so important, that the U.S. HAB research is viewed with great respect, both nationally and internationally, and that's because of this program. The negatives, well, the research has gotten these funding cuts that you're all aware of, leading to these lost opportunities. We've had discussions. Have we lost a generation of HAB scientists during these gaps in funding? Will we lose another? Remember this, down there at the end, if you're a new student graduating, you had a very difficult time building a program, getting a job, that happened. Is it going to happen? That's very hard to say, but it's certainly a concern. To me, it's very worrisome that regional EcoHab and MERHAB projects are not being funded. I think those have been hugely helpful to our national understanding of these problems. And it's also worrisome that the ship time funding has gone away, and those are related issues there. I think sustained competitive research funding programs for freshwater HABs don't exist yet, except for NOAA in the Great Lakes. That's another concern. Congress, the public, and many stakeholders are expecting more progress. You hear it again and again, especially when you go to the Hill. What are you doing about these? You want to stop them. They're so used to treating fields with pesticides and herbicides and so forth. Why can't we do that? And many of you have heard me get up on this soapbox before. I think we can do more. I think we're being a little cautious. Even with the PCM HAB program, which was set up for just that purpose, progress in that specific area has still been slow in this country. But my hope is that with freshwater, where that kind of mitigation or manipulation is much more accepted and common, maybe that's going to not only can help us in the freshwater area, but it'll spill over into the marine area as well. Okay, a few final thoughts. Overall, I think we have many, many reasons to be proud. We have indeed been a very productive research community. And we are a community. We're a family. And these meetings help. They get us together like no other meeting does. We get to know each other. We get to know what each other's doing. We collaborate. We talk. And that's wonderful. We cannot let up. It's always this. It's like a parent talking to a kid. We're doing well. But, okay, we can't let our efforts to sustain and build our national programs, we can't let up. Every year we have to do these battles in Congress, but I do remain optimistic. We have never had the level of congressional support that we have right now, and we have to take advantage of it. But some of our early leaders, some of us that have been doing this, are either retiring or just plain tired. What's happening? There we go. So, and this, I have to explain this. I'm trying to make a point with this slide, which is that I'm tired, okay? But just so you know, this is how you tune a guitar in a noisy bar, okay? I'm just saying, okay? So, anyway, thankfully, the next several generations of HAB researchers are trained, capable, and energetic. We should be in very good hands. And I'm just going to throw pictures up here. Please don't be offended if your picture's not here. I've tried to just run around and take pictures at different times and pull from archives. But we've got this is sort of the 2G, the second generation, if you will. Some people that are moving up and leading our field. You can see Chris Gobler there, that picture's 10 years old, but you couldn't tell, right? But, and then, there's certainly many, many more than what I'm showing here. But really, the future is here with the students. I've just taken a picture of some of them, young, energetic, enthusiastic. This was the Young Investigators meeting. Just basically, this is our hope. This is what these meetings have been all about. I think the future looks promising, but not without its challenges. But I think we're up to it. So I hope now you feel like those of you who didn't know anything about how we got here, you can understand it's been a long battle with wars, and we've recovered. We're doing well. So with that, I will finish, and thank you very much for your attention.